Magnificent Obsession by Lloyd C. Douglas. Chapter 1. It had lately become common chatter at Brightwood Hospital, better known for 300 miles around Detroit as Hudson's Clinic, that the chief was all but dead on his feet. The whole place buzzed with it. All the way from the inquisitive solarium on the top floor to the garrulous kitchen in the basement, little groups, convalescents in wheelchairs, nurses with tardy trays, lean interns on rubber soles, grizzled orderlies trailing damp mops, met to whisper and separated to disseminate the bad news. Dr. Hudson was on the verge of a collapse. On the verge? Indeed. One lengthening story had it that on Tuesday he had fainted during an operation. Mighty ticklish piece of business, too, which young Watson, assisting him, was obliged to complete alone, and the worst of it was that he was back at it again next morning carrying on as usual. An idle tale like that, no matter with what solicitude of loyalty it might be discussed at Brightwood, would deal the institution a staggering wallop once it seeped through the big wrought iron gates, and the rumor was peculiarly difficult to throttle because, unfortunately, it was true. Obviously, the hour had arrived for desperate measures. Dr. Malcolm Pyle, shaggy and beetle-browed, next to the chief in seniority, a specialist in abdominal surgery and admiringly spoken of by his colleagues as the best belly man west of the Alleghenies, growled briefly into the ear of Blood and Skin Jennings, a cynical, middle-aged bachelor, who but for his skill as a bacteriologist would have been dropped from the staff many a time for his rasping banter and infuriating impudences. Jennings quickly passed the word to internal medicine Carter, who presently met eye, ear, nose, and throat McDermott in the hall and relayed the message. "Oh, yes, I'll come," said McDermott uneasily, "but I don't relish the idea of a staff meeting without the chief. Looks like treason." "It's for his own good," explained Carter. "Doubtless, but he's always been such a straight shooter himself." "You tell Aldrich and Watson. I'll see Graham and Harper. I hate it as much as you do, Mac, but we can't let the chief ruin himself." Seeing that tomorrow was Christmas, and this was Saturday well past the luncheon hour, by the time Pyle had tardily joined them in the superintendent's office, each of the 8, having abandoned whatever manifestation of dignified omniscience constituted his bedside manner, was snappishly impatient to have done with this unpleasant business and be off. When at length he breezed in, not very convincingly attempting the conciliatory smirk of the belated, Pyle found them glum and fidgety, Carter savagely reducing to shavings what remained of a pencil, Aldrich rattling the pages of his engagement book, McDermott meticulously pecking at diminutive bits of lint on his coat sleeve, Watson ostentatiously shaking his watch at his ear, Graham drumming an exasperating tattoo on Nancy Ashford's desk, and the others pacing around like hungry panthers. "Well," said Pyle, seating them with a sweeping gesture, "y'all know what we're here for." "Absolutely," drawled Jennings. "That old boy must be warned." "At once," snapped Graham. "I'll say," muttered McDermott. "And you, Pyle, are the proper person to do it." Anticipating a tempestuous rejoinder, Jennings hastened to defend himself against the impending din by noisily pounding out his pipe on the rim of Mrs. Ashford's steel wastebasket, a performance she watched with sour interest. "Where do you get that old boy stuff, Jennings?" demanded Pyle, projecting a fierce, myopic glare at his pestiferous crony. "He's not much older than you are." Watson tilted his chair back on its hind legs, cautiously turned his head in the direction of Carter, seated next to him, and slowly closed one eye. This was going to be good. Dr. Hudson was 46 last May, quietly volunteered the superintendent, without looking up. You ought to know, conceded Jennings, dryly. She met his rough insinuation with level, unacknowledged eyes. May 25th, she added. Thanks so much, the point's settled then, but all the same, he wasn't a day under 146 when he slumped out of his operating room this morning, haggard and shaky. It's getting spread about, too, complained Carter. Take it up with him, Dr. Pyle, wheedled McDermott. Tell him we all think he needs a vacation, a long one. Pyle snorted contemptuously and aimed a bushy eyebrow at him. That's good. Tell him we all think, eh? It's a mighty careless, offhand damn that Hudson would give for what we all think. Did you ever? He pointed a bony finger at the perspiring McDermott. Did you ever feel moved to offer a few comradely suggestions to Dr. Wayne Hudson relative to the better management of his personal affairs? McDermott rosily hadn't, and Pyle's dry voice crackled again. As I thought. That explains how, with so little display of emotion, you could advise somebody else to do it. You see, my son. He dropped his tone of raillery and became sincere. We're dealing here with an odd number. Nobody quite like him in the whole world. Full of funny crochets. In a psychiatric clinic, which this hospital is going to be shortly, with the entire staff in straitjackets, some of Hudson's charming little idiosyncrasies would be brutally referred to as clean-cut psychosis. The silence in Mrs. Ashford's office was tense. Pyle's regard for the chief was known to be little short of idolatry. What, indeed, was he preparing to say? Did he actually believe that Hudson was off the rails? Now, don't misunderstand, he went on quickly, sensing their amazement. Hudson's entitled to all his whimsies. So far as I'm concerned, he has earned the right to his flock of phantoms. He is a genius, and whosoever loveth a genius is out of luck with his devotion, except he beareth all things, endureth all things, suffereth long, and is kind. Not like sounding brass, interpolated Jennings piously. Apropos of brass, growled Pyle, but no matter. We all know that the chief is the most important figure in the field of brain surgery on this continent, but he did not come to that distinction by accident. He has toiled like a slave in a mill. His specialty is guaranteed to make a man moody. Counts himself lucky if he can hold down his mortality to 50%. What kind of mentality would you have, shifting his attention to Jennings, who grinned amiably, if you lost half your cases? They'd soon have you trussed in a big tub of hot water, feeding you through the nose with a syringe. You spoke of the chief's psychoses, interrupted McDermott, approaching the dangerous word hesitatingly. Do you mean that literally? Pyle pursed his lips and nodded slowly. Yes, literally. One of his notions, by far the most alarming of his legion, insofar as the present dilemma is affected, has to do with his curious attitude toward fear. He mustn't be afraid of anything. He must live above fear. That is his phrase. You would think to hear his prattle that he was a wealthy and neurotic old lady trying to graduate from Theosophy into Baha'ism. What's Baha'ism? Inquired Jennings, with pretended naivety. Hudson believes, continued Pyle, disdainful of the annoyance, that if a man harbors any sort of fear, no matter how benign and apparently harmless, it percolates through all his thinking, damages his personality, makes him landlord to a ghost. For years, he has been so consistently living above fear of slumping, fear of the natural penalties of overwork, fear of the neural drain of insomnia. Haven't you heard him discoursing on the delights of reading in bed to 3 o'clock? Fear of that little aneurysm he know he's got, that he has driven himself at full gallop with spurs on his boots and burrs under his saddle, caroling about his freedom until he's ready to drop. But whoever cautions him will be warnedly damned for his impertinence. Pyle had temporarily run down, and discussion became general. Carter risked suggesting that if the necessary interview with the chief required a gift for impertinence, why not deputize Jennings? Aldrich said it was no time for kidding. McDermott again nominated Pyle. Graham shouted, "Of course!" They pushed back their chairs. Pyle brought both big hands down on his knees with a resounding slap, rose with a groan, and sourly promised he'd have a go at it. "Atta boy," commended Jennings paternally. "Watson'll do your stitches afterwards. He's been getting some uncommonly nice cosmetic values lately with his scars. Eh, Watty?" The disorder incident to adjournment spared Watson the chagrin of listening to the threatened report of Jennings eavesdropping an hour earlier on the dulcet cooing of a recently discharged patient back to tender her gratitude. Emboldened by his rescue, he dispassionately told Jennings to go to hell, much to the latter's fawn-like satisfaction, and the staff evaporated. "Let's go and eat," said Pyle. As they turned the corner in the corridor, Jennings slipped his hand under Pyle's elbow and muttered, "You know damned well what ails the chief, and so do I. It's the girl." "Joyce, you mean? Who else?" Jennings buttoned his overcoat collar high about his throat and thrust his shoulder against the big front door and an 80-mile gale. "Certainly I mean Joyce. She's running wild, and he's worrying his heart out and his head off." "Maybe so." Pyle picked his footing carefully on the snowy steps. "But I don't believe it's very good cricket for us to analyze his family affairs." "Nonsense. We're quite past the time for indulging in any nightly restraints. Hudson's in danger of shooting his reputation to bits. Incidentally, he'll give the whole clinic a black eye when the news spreads. If the chief is off his feed because he's fretting about his girl, then it's high time we talk candidly about her. She's a silly little ass, if you ask my opinion." "Well, you won't be asked for your opinion, and it's no good at coming at it in that mood. She may be, as you say, a silly little ass, but she's Hudson's deity." Jennings motioned him to climb into the coupe and fumbled in his pockets for his keys. "She wasn't behaving much like a deity, unless Bacchus, perhaps, last time I saw her." "Where was that?" "At the Tuileries, about a month ago, with a party of 8 or 10 noisy roisterers, in the general custody for that good-for-nothing young Merrick, you know. Old Nick Merrick's carousing grandson, and believe me, they were well oiled." Did she recognize you?" "Oh, quite so. Came fluttering over to our table to speak to me." "Humph. She must have been pickled. I thought she was getting on all right at a girls' school in Washington. Didn't know she was home." Jennings warmed his engine noisily and threw in the clutch. "Maybe she was sacked." Pyle made some hopeless noise deep in his throat. "Too bad about old Merrick. Salt of the earth, finest of the fine. He's had more than his share of trouble. Did you ever know Cliff?" "Nah, he was dead. But I heard of him. Bum, wasn't he?" "That describes him, and this orphan of his seems to be headed in the same direction." "Orphan? I thought this boy's mother was living. Paris or somewhere." "Oh, yes, she's living. But the boy's an orphan for all that. Born an orphan." Pyle briefly reviewed the Merrick saga. "Perhaps," suggested Jennings as they rolled into the club garage. "You might have a chat with poor old Merrick, if he's such a good sort. Tell him his whelp is contaminating influence to our girl." "Pfft." Pyle led the way to the elevator. Well, if the proposal's no good, why don't you go manfully to the young lady herself and inform her that she's driving her eminent parent crazy? Put it up to her as a matter of good sportsmanship." "No," objected Pyle, hooking his glasses athwart his nose to inspect the menu. "She would only air her indignation to her father, and he likes people to mind their own business, as you've discovered on 2 or 3 occasions. He keeps his own counsel like a clam, and doesn't thank anybody for crashing into his affairs, no matter how benevolent may be the motive. It'd be quite useless anyway. Joyce can't help the way she's made. She's a biological throwback to her maternal grandfather. You never knew it. He was just putting the finishing touches to his career as a periodical sot when I arrived in this town fresh from school. Cummings was the best all-round surgeon and the hardest all-round drinker in the state of Michigan for 20 years. One of these 3-day soused and 3-week sober drunkards. This girl evidently carries an overplus of that old chap's chromosomes." "You mean she's a dipsomaniac?" "Well, that's a nasty word. Let's just say she's erratic. Ever since she was a little tot, she's been a storm center. Sweetest thing in the world when she wants to be, and then all hell breaks loose, and Hudson has to plead with the teachers to take her back. Oh, she's given him an exciting life, no doubt of that. And lately, it's booze." "Hudson knows about that part of it, of course." "I presume so. How could he help it? She makes no secret of it. At all events, she's no hypocrite." Jennings sighed. "Rather unfortunate she has this one embarrassing virtue, isn't it? But, that being the case, I dare say she'll have to go to the devil at her own speed. We must persuade Hudson, however. Clear out, take a long leave of absence. He can take her along. Lay it on with a heavy hand, Pyle. Be utterly ruthless. Tell him it affects us all. That ought to fetch him. I never knew anybody quite so sensitive to the welfare of other people. Save that last card for the last trick. Tell him if he doesn't clear out now, for a while, he'll do up the rest of us." For the first half hour of their conference, which was held in the chief's office the following Tuesday, Pyle stubbornly held out for a trip around the world, Joyce to accompany her father. Indeed, the idea had seemed so good that he had armed himself with a portfolio of attractive cruise literature. He'd even made out an intriguing itinerary: Hawaii, Tahiti's, ukuleles. Pyle was a confirmed landlubber with a dangerously suppressed desire to lie on his back, pleasantly jingled under a transequatorial palm, listening to the soft vowels of grown-up children unspoiled by civilization. The Mediterranean countries. 6 months of hobnobbing with brain specialists in Germany. The latter item had been included as a particularly tempting bait. Hudson had often declared he meant to do that someday. The chief listened preoccupiedly, tried to seem grateful, tried to seem interested. But as Pyle rumbled on with his sales talk, the big man grew restless, refilled his fountain pen, rearranged his papers in neater piles, had much difficulty in hunting a matchbox. Then he shook his head, smiling. No, much as he appreciated Pyle's friendly concern, he wasn't going around the world, not just now. Of course he had been sticking at it too steadily. Lately, he had had it in his mind to build a little shack in some way of the out-of-the-way place, not too far off, and put in there from Friday afternoon to Tuesday morning, at least in decent weather. Tramp, fish, botanize, read light novels, sleep, live the simple life. He would begin plans on such a place at once. Spring would be along soon. "And meantime?" persisted Pyle, gnawing at the tip of his up-tilted little goatee. Hudson rose, slammed a drawer shut with a bang, swung a leg over the corner of a desk, folded his arms tightly, and faced his counselor with a mysterious grin. "Meantime. Pyle, I hope this won't knock you cold. I'm going down to Philadelphia, week after next, to marry my daughter's school friend, Miss Helen Brent." Pyle's eyes and mouth comically registered such stunned amazement that the Hudson grin widened. "And then the 3 of us will be spending a couple of months in Europe. I've arranged with Leighton to come over from the university, take care of such head cases as Watson can't handle.
Watson's a good man, bright future. Oddly enough, I was on the point of asking you in to talk this over when you said you wished to see me.
Pyle bit off the end of a fresh cigar and mumbled felicitations, not yet sufficiently recovered to pretend enthusiasm.
Doubtless you think me a fool, Pyle.
Hudson took a turn up and down the room, giving his colleague an opportunity to deny it if he wished. Pyle puffed meditatively.
17 years a widower,
mused Hudson, half to himself. He paused at the far corner to straighten a disordered shelf of books.
Man accumulates a lot of habits in 17 years.
He returned to his desk chair.
Sounds like a wedding of January and June, eh?
Had Jennings been in Pyle's place, his eyes would have twinkled as he replied,
January?
What? You? January? Nonsense, Chief. Not a day over October at the farthest. Pyle smiled wanly and shifted his cigar to the corner of his mouth.
I came by this valuable new friendship early last year when Miss Brent was made junior advisor to my Joyce.
Something of sympathetic comradeship at Pyle's reviving interest, now that he was partially coming to, encouraged Hudson to toss aside what remained of his reticence and tell it all. To begin with, Miss Brent was an orphan. Parents reputable Virginians, most interesting French background on her mother's side, same kind of blood that the guillotine spilt in 1789.
Quite pronouncedly Gaelic she is, at least in appearance.
Jennings, had he been there, would have been audacious enough to suggest, slyly chuckling, "Oh, in that case we should amend June to July." Then he would have watched the chief's face intently. But Pyle, who had no traffic with psychoanalysis, attached no significance whatever to the fact that the young lady's probable temperament was somewhat on the chief's mind.
About Thanksgiving, Hudson was saying, Miss Brent, after a brief encounter with influenza, left the school and spent a few days at home. No sooner was she gone than Joyce slipped out one night, attended a party down in the city, defied some house rules as to hours, flicked all her classes the next day, stormed until the shingles rattled when they rebuked her, and, in short, contrived to get herself suspended, notwithstanding that her record, thanks to Miss Brent's influence, had been quite above reproach ever since she matriculated a year ago last September.
The story went forward rather jerkily. Hudson was not given to confiding his perplexities to anybody. Pyle discreetly remained silent.
Well, she came home and plunged immediately into a series of hectic affairs. Out every night, in bed most of the days. Nervous, testy, unreasonable. I can't tell you, Pyle, how thoroughly it did me in. She's all I have, you know. At my wit's end, I suggested that she invite Miss Brent up to visit us through the holidays. Twice before, she had been our guest for a few days, and I had seen something of her on my occasional visits to Washington. Believe me when I tell you that this charming girl was no more than across our threshold last week than Joyce was another creature. Poised, gracious, lovable. A lady.
He paused to take his bearings before going further, impelled to explain how the swift movement of events, that first evening at dinner, amply accounted for his decision to account Helen to marry him. Reluctant, even in the interest of plausibility and self-defense, to give words to the memory of that occasion. It had all been so natural, so unimpeachably right, so precisely as it ought to be. He had remarked, perhaps a bit more ardently than he intended, for his heart was full. How happy it had made him, and Joyce, that she had come.
I don't see how we can ever let you go, he had said,
to which Joyce had added impetuously, Why need she ever go? She's happier here than anywhere else, aren't you, darling? Pyle recrossed his legs and cleared his throat to remind the chief that he was still present.
As a matter of fact, Miss Brent is certain to be happier with us than she was at home. Since childhood, she had lived with an uncle, her father's elder brother, an irascible, penurious, not very successful old lawyer. There are no women in the family, and I have reason to suspect that her cousin, Montgomery Brent, is a bit of a rake, though she has idealized him out of all proportion. Calls him Brother Monty, thinks him vastly misunderstood by his father and everybody else. And that kind of girl, pile. Spouses the cause of homeless cats, underdogs, misunderstood cousins, my flighty, willful Joyce, and now, thank God, she's promised to join forces with me. And I think she's making something of a mission of it, pile. I was quite willing to wait until she had finished school in June. Had some serious misgivings, indeed, about that. But she dismissed the thought lightly. If I needed her, I needed her now, she said. I hope to God it works out.
Pyle said he believed it would, moved to the edge of his chair, looked at his watch, asked if this was a secret. Hudson stroked his jaw, his eyes averted.
I don't object to their knowing. Let's consider it sufficient for the present that I'm going to Europe with my daughter.
He mopped his broad forehead vigorously.
The rest of it they can learn in due time. Report to Aldrich and Carter and the others that I'm off on vacation.
Any special word for Mrs. Ashford, Chief? Pyle paused with his hands on the doorknob. Hudson thrust his hands deeply into his trouser pockets and walked to the window, staring out.
I'll tell her myself, Pyle,
he answered, without turning. Dr. Hudson named his isolated retreat Flint Ridge. It was quite remote from the beaten trail of travel. A mere acre had been tamed to serve the cottage for which his hasty sketches, before leaving, were elaborated and executed in his absence by his loyal friend, Fred Ferguson, the best architect in town. It was an inhospitable bit of country thereabouts. Sheer cliffs, descending abruptly to the black water. A long flight of wooden steps led to this little boathouse and adjacent wharf. It had discouraged such colonization as had long since developed the western shore, 2 miles distant. Deformed pines clawed the rocks, sighing of their thirst in summer, shrieking of nakedness in winter. Almost from the first, Flint Ridge never knew certainly, for there was no telephone, when its master would appear for a weekend. It anticipated, made forecasts, baked ineffable angel food cakes, caught vast quantities of minnows for bait, and held itself in instant readiness to welcome the big man with the ruddy face. Just a shade too ruddy, any heart diagnostician could have told him. Silver white hair, gray eyes with deep crow's feet, and expressive hands eloquent of highly developed dexterity. When and if he came, it would be on a Saturday, late afternoon. Only once had he brought Joyce and Helen. Strangers passing them presumed they were both his daughters, but that was merely temporizing with his promise to seek a retreat. And he now needed days off, if ever, for his young wife's gregarious disposition and charming hospitality had multiplied his social obligations in the city. How easily she had adjusted himself to his moods. How proud he was of her, not quite so much for her exotic beauty, as because of her exquisiteness of personal taste and the tact with which she met the rather exacting problems of fitting neatly and quickly into his circle of mature acquaintances. It delighted him that she chose the right word, wore the right costume, intuitively knew how to manage a dinner party without seeming concerned as to what misadventures might have occurred in the kitchen. Yes, the affair was working out. How often he had used that phrase. Immeasurably better than he had dared hope. Even the woman liked her. Even the women liked her. They had accepted her on approval at first, but when it became evident that she had no intention of taking on airs because their grizzled spouses fluttered about her with the broad compliments privilege to 50 addressing 25, they admitted she was a dear. But however pleasant it was for Hudson to note his wife's growing popularity, certified to by the increasing volume of their social activities, his new duties contributed little to the reinvigoration of that fatigued aorta which had worried Pyle.
Chief's in better fettle, I think, said Jennings.
Temporarily, conceded Pyle. But you don't mend an aneurysm with late dinners, 3 a week. I'm afraid he'll crash one of these days. Not infrequently, some visiting colleague for Brightwood now not only attracted patients from afar, but had become a mecca for the ambitious in the field of brain surgery, would be driven out into the country to rusticate for a day or two. They seemed singularly alike, these brain tinkers from otherwhere. Moody, abstracted men in their late 40s and early 50s, most of them, seldom smiling, ungifted with small talk, not unusually inclined to be somewhat gruff. Hudson preferred to hold conferences with them at the lake, for their conversation would be tiresomely technical. And anyhow, men who trafficked daily with death could not be expected to enliven a house party. A devoted pair of middle-aged twins served as caretakers at Flintridge. What time Perry Ruggles, of the stiff-knee, hairy-throated, Airedale disposition, was not tinkering the boat engine with greasy wrenches or trolling in and out a season for bass, he was teaching little patches of apathetic soil to take a maternal interest in iris and petunias. On Saturdays about 5 o'clock, he would put on his other coat and limp down to the gate that admitted from the narrow ridge road, and, having opened it, would flick little stones off the driveway with his good foot. Martha, his bosom sister, wrought ingenious quilts, congealed from the taciturn Perry the vandalisms of an impertinent, bottle-fed fawn, was silly over a pair of tame pheasants whose capacity for requiting her affection was as feeble as her need was great, scratched her plump arms gathering early berries in anticipation of some high moment when her pie would be approved with a slow wink, of which the learned guest, profoundly discoursing of surgical mysteries to his celebrated host, would be entirely unaware. On Saturdays, about 4:30, having again made sure she laid out the doctor's pajamas on the bed, and turning the vase of roses on his chiffonier a little more to the advantage of the tallest, Martha would take her stand before the window in the sun parlor, her knuckles pressed hard against her pretty teeth, devoutly praying for a swirl of yellow dust and a flash of glittering nickel at the bend of the ridge road, visible through an open lane of dwarf spruce. At the sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires, she would dash to the door and fling it open, always hoping, and hating herself for it, that the doctor would come alone, or, if not alone, accompanied by another man. She had been uneasy, abashed, and awkward in the presence of young Mrs. Hudson, whose beauty had stirred remembrance of a certain pre-Christmas shopping excursion when she was 9. There had been a French doll, so beautiful it had made Martha's little throat ache with longing. Her wistful eyes had gushed sudden tears, and she had put out a hand tentatively. "No, dear," her mother had cautioned. "You may look at her, but you mustn't touch." On the broad mantel in the gun room, there had been a bit of chafing about the gun room, seeing as there was only one gun in it among all the miscellaneous instruments of sport, golf clubs, fishing tackle, and the like. An impressive row of silver cups testified that Wayne Hudson was no less expert at play than with the important implements of surgery. It was a frequent remark of his intimates that Hudson possessed an almost uncanny capacity for projecting the sensitiveness of his cognitive fingers to the very tips of whatever tools he chose to manipulate. There were nerves in his niblick, in his casting rod, in his scalpel. "A lucky devil," bystanders used to remark when he had successfully made a long putt upgrade on a sporty green. "An uncommonly good guesser," his confrères agreed occasionally when some quite daring prognosis, probably defining the exact location of a brain tumor on such cryptic evidence as the arc of an eyebrow, the twitch of a lip, the posture of a hand in repose, or the interjection of an unbecoming phrase into casual conversation, was verified. Among the trophies on the mantel, whose inscriptions always amazed a visiting colleague, marveling at his distinguished host's diversity of proficiencies, there was a tarnished, triple-handed aquatic prize won by Dr. Hudson when, in the early days of his internship, he had taken a first in a mile swim. "Still swim?" "Regularly." Enjoy it?
Well, it's good for me.
Keeps your weight down?
Perhaps, but in any event, it's good for me.
Sometime in the course of his visit, the visitor would rag his athletic host upon the excess of his prudence, for his most conspicuous article of furniture in the gun room was an elaborate but not very decorative inhalator of the super type used by lifesavers at busy wharves and crowded beaches, equipped with nickeled oxygen tanks and a complication of mechanical mysteries. "What is that thing?" Hudson would tell him, briefly, brusquely. "What do you want with it?"
Somebody might fall in. Water's deep out here."
It was clear enough to the guest, if he ventured to press his queries, that Dr. Hudson did not enjoy any talk about aquatics. The guest found himself wondering why. Perry Ruggles could have explained had he been disposed. There had once been a very anxious hour at Flint Ridge down on the narrow pier. Not even Martha knew. The next time he had come out, Dr. Hudson had brought the inhalator and had explained its use to the terrified Perry, who thereafter stood in dread of the thing. It became a grim specter that haunted his life. Some day he suspected he would be obliged to experiment with it. The responsibility constituted a steady, remorseless threat that tortured him and kept his awake nights. Some sharp, man-to-man candor had been handed to the surgeon that afternoon by his uncouth caretaker. It had been a long time since anybody had called Wayne Hudson a fool to his face. He accepted the degree with dignity.
"Perhaps I am, Perry,"
he replied soberly.
"You probably wouldn't know, but however that may be, the thing you're to keep in mind is that this top valve controls the oxygen, and if you have occasion to use it, don't get excited and forget."
Not a few men of importance to the surgical world resident in widely spaced cities recalled having had brief and somewhat disquieting conversations about swimming while guests at Flint Ridge, when one Sunday morning in early August they read the front page dispatch where reported that Dr. Wayne Hudson, widely known brain surgeon of Detroit, had drowned the late afternoon before near his summer place on Lake Saginaw. At their breakfast table in Seattle, Dr. Herman Bliss read the shocking headlines to his wife, and when she had commented sympathetically, he added, "Not only very sad, my dear, but very strange." Pressed for explanation, he reviewed for her the incidents of a visit he had paid to his friend at the lake cottage, and the heavy constraint which had fallen upon their conversation when he had made some inquiries about his host's enjoyment of the water. "Do you suppose," conjectured Mrs. Bliss, "that there could have lurked in his mind some vague mirage of the fate that waited for him?" Her husband pursed his lips and shook his head.
"I don't take much stock in such theories,"
he declared, almost too vehemently to be convincing. "But you once told me that Dr. Hudson was prescient."
"Only a form of speech, Grace. Nobody is prescient. However, Hudson was extraordinarily sentient. Psychic to an uncommon degree."
"But why did he persist in swimming?" inquired Mrs. Bliss, "if he was afraid of it."
"For that very reason, unquestionably. I never knew a man so impatient of normal people's timidities, or more passionately eager to make himself independent of fear. Doubtless this was the one thing that gave him anxiety, and he was resolved to master it."
"But by the same logic," objected Mrs. Bliss, "he might have jumped off a precipice if he found himself afraid of that."
"Not quite the same thing. Here was something he had been able to do with ease, skill, and safety. Now, for some reason, he had suddenly become afraid of it. An experience of cramp, perhaps, might happen again. The fear filtered through his thinking. He had prided himself on living in complete mental liberty, knew now that he was housing a dread. So long as he gave that phobia the hospitality of his mind, he would be, by that much, no longer his own man, so he decided to go to the mat with his antagonist. I fancy that explains."
The newspaper account further detailed that By a singular coincidence, the inhalator which Dr. Hudson owned and kept at his cottage was in use on the other side of the little lake at the exact moment of his own tragic need of it. A few hundred yards offshore, near his grandfather's estate, Windermere, young Robert Merrick, alone in his sailboat, had been knocked unconscious by a jibbing boom and pushed into the water.
"Must have been drunk," indignantly commented Dr. Bliss. "Things like that don't happen often to sober people."
Excited bathers, informed that there was an inhalator at the Hudson cottage, had rushed a speedboat across for it, and after an hour's heroic exertion, were successful in restoring the young man to partial consciousness. It was said that he would undoubtedly recover.
"Unquestionably, he would," growled Bliss.
It was believed, said the dispatch, that had the inhalator been immediately available and promptly applied, Dr. Hudson's life might have been saved. The caretaker, Perry Ruggles, observing the evident distress of his employer, had rowed quickly to the spot, dived for him, dragged his limp body into the boat. Desperately, Ruggles had set forth with his unconscious passenger towards the Windermere beach, and had rowed until his strength failed. Small craft, attracted by his signals, hurried to him, found him huddled over the lifeless bottle of Dr. Hudson, weeping hysterically, while the little boat drifted in the middle of the lake.
"Never saw such dog-like devotion as old Perry's. I suppose he went in after him, clothes and all. Bad leg, too."
Robert Merrick, the paper continued to explain, was the only son of the late Clifford Merrick and Mrs. Maxine Merrick, now resident in Paris. He had only that day returned from an extended visit with his mother, having gone abroad immediately after finishing at the State University in the mid-year senior class. He was further identified as the grandson of Nicholas J. Merrick, retired founder and large stockholder at the Axion Motor Corporation, with whom he had made his home at Windermere.
"Hope this youngster will be able to realize how valuable a person he is," said Dr. Bliss, putting down the paper, "now that he has had his life handed back to him at such a price."
There was still another coincidence connected with this event. The village physician, suspecting that Merrick's head injury might be in need of more skillful examination than he could give, had sent him in a swift ambulance to Brightwood Hospital. At that moment, he did not know that the man who had made Brightwood famous for its brain surgery would be unable to see his young patient. "What do you suppose the young boy said," speculated Mrs. Bliss, "when he learned what it had cost to save his life?"
"Well," reflected the doctor glumly, "from my own observation of the type of a young cub whose father is dead, whose mother lives in Paris, whose doting grandfather is a retired millionaire, and who gets himself bumped off his boat by a boom in broad daylight, I should suppose he just scratched a match on the head of his bed and mumbled, 'What do you know about that?'"
Chapter 2. Slowly and carefully, for he was still limp from his battle with pneumonia, resultant from the prolonged use of a lung motor in the inexperienced hands of excited people, 2 nurses had trundled young Merrick up to the well-appointed solarium.
"It won't hurt him a bit," Dr. Watson had said, "and there is at least the suspicion of a breeze upstairs."
Parking his chair in an alcove somewhat sequestered from the general assembly of convalescents, most of them white-turbaned like himself, his uncommunicative attendants had pattered quickly away as if relieved to be off to more pleasant undertakings. Their scamper added to his perplexity. Yesterday he had tried to explain the prevailing taciturnity of the people who had waited on him. It was the weather. The muggy, mid-August humidity accounted for it. If doctors were brief and brusque, nurses crisp and remote, it was because the patients were fretful, everything out of sorts, naturally. But even so, Something more serious than a low barometer ailed this hospital. Its moodiness was too thick to be interpreted by a murky yellow sky. The abominable rasp of cicadas in the dusty maples, or the enervating heat. Brightwood was in trouble. Nor could Bobby shake off the feeling that he himself was somehow at the bottom of it. Else why this conspiracy of mute glumness in their attitude toward him? My God! He might as well have been some penniless bum fished out of the gutter and patched up for sheer humanity's sake. Didn't they know who he was? Why, his grandfather could buy up the whole works and never miss it. It wasn't that they neglected him. He was bound to admit. Somebody had always been hovering over him. God, what a ghastly experience he had been through. That fog, drifting in grayish white, balloon-like billows across the road, impenetrable, acrid, suffocating. A damp, chilling, clean cloud that pressed painfully against his chest, swathed his arms, clogged his feet. That trip back from elsewhere. Would he ever live long enough to forget? It made him shudder to remember it. That unutterable fatigue. Sometimes it had been more than he could bear. After he had plodded, staggering, groping his way for a few shaky steps, the thing would rush him, with a roar like heavy surf, and hurl him incredible distance back toward oblivion. Then the violence of the storm would subside, followed by an ominous silence. Was he really dead, this time? Suddenly, the thing would swoop him up again and pitch him deeper into the stifling fog. After years and years of that, he had grown old and stiff and sore with the hopeless struggle. The situation had begun to clear. Now and again there were ragged rents in the fabric of the fog through which certain landmarks might be fleetingly recognized as steeples and spires come up faintly on an acid-touched plate. These hazy perceptions were at first exclusively olfactory. He had read, though, somewhere, that the nose was more integrally a part of brain than his other sense organs. Perhaps the smelling faculty, he had taken more than a casual interest in physiology, was the oldest of all the perceptive organs, earliest to evolve. But no, that would be feeling. Feeling first, then smelling. It had amazed and amused him that part of his mind seemed to be trudging alongside, analyzing the predicament of the rest of his mind, wading through the fog. Now there had come a much wider gap in the drifting cloud, and though it breathed a combination of identifiable odors, strong scents crushed hard against his face, the smell of good wool, and buried in the wool, iodoform, cigarette smoke, chlorides of this, that, and the other, anesthetics, antiseptics, laboratory smells, hospital smells. A weight shifted about on his chest. It was warm. It throbbed. It pressed firmly, rested briefly, moved a little space, paused again, listened. Went back to spots it had visited before, listened more intently. Then the weight had lifted and the medley of smells vanished. Through the next rift in the fog, voices were speaking from a vast distance, one of them calm, assured, the other bitter, unfriendly. That had been the beginning of his perplexity. I believe he's going to pull through. Doubtless, and it's a damned shame. After that, there had been a complicated jumble of voices, one of them a woman's, before the fog closed in on him again. Occasionally, the cloud would tear apart and he would take up his load. He seemed to be carrying some enormous weight, and plod on woodenly. He would have yawned, but deep breathing had gone out. They weren't doing it anymore. Quite too painful. One breathed in short, dry, hot gasps, glad to have them at the price. Tom Masterson had confirmed the fact. Tom, doubtless this was part of his delirium, Tom had sat by the bed and queried about the new style of breathing, remarked, "That's the way we're all doing it now. Not nearly so good as the old way, of course, but better than none." Another smothering billow of fog had engulfed him, but the thing wasn't in it. He didn't mind now, so long as the thing was gone. He opened his eyes and glimpsed a square of blue sky through a real window. The curtain fluttered. A motor churned in a court somewhere below. Gears rasped. Gravel scrunched. Ice tinkled in a glass near at hand. A starched nurse, eyes intent on her watch, fumbled for his forearm. The sharp tip of a thermometer dug cruelly into the roots of his tongue. That was what ailed it then. All this awkward gouging while he had been unconscious. He had become aware of the steady drone of an electric fan, the metallic whir of a lawnmower in parched grass. Had dully explored his cracked lips with a clumsy tongue. Had regarded with apathy the nurse who bent over him, and, after a few hoarse croaks, had contrived to ask where he was. She told him. Sluggishly, he surmised that his presence at Brightwood indicated that there was something wrong with his head. There was. It ached abominably. Was bandaged. He felt of it gingerly and inquired, "A hard bump, but you are doing very nicely. Drink this, please." And then he had slept some more. A dim light was burning when he awoke. Everything was very quiet, so he decided to go to sleep again. Another day came, 2 or 3 of them maybe, he couldn't remember. A young red-headed doctor in a white coat had appeared and asked some questions of the nurse. Seemed a friendly person, but young. Dr. Hudson was the big man at this place. If there was something the matter with his head, he wanted Hudson. "I say," he had called, stiffly turning his eyes toward the doctor. "Why doesn't Dr. Hudson look in? He knows me. I've been at his house. Does he know I'm here?" "I'm Dr. Watson, Mr. Merrick. I'm looking after you. Dr. Hudson is not in the city." After Dr. Hudson had left the room, he had beckoned the nurse to the bedside. Had Miss Hudson called? No. But that was because he wasn't seeing visitors yet. That is, not many. Yes, his grandfather had been in. And a Mr. Masterson? The accident? Oh, yes, they would tell him all about that a little later. What he needed now was sleep. Lots and lots of it. No worry or excitement. What we wanted now to make us well was sleep. Then we could have visitors, and the visitors would tell us everything we wanted to know. That kind of silly baby talk. Hell's bells! This morning, however, he had grown impatient. These people were carrying their stupid silence too far. Obviously, he had been in some sort of scrape. Very well. It was not the first time. There would be some way to settle it. There always had been. Was he not accustomed to paying for smashed fenders, broken china, splintered furniture, outraged feelings, and interrupted business? If anybody had a grievance, let him make a bill of it, and he would draw a check. It wasn't any of the hospital's business anyway. Or was it? What could he have done to their damned hospital? Run into it? "Tell me this much, won't you, Miss Bates? Miss Bates, just how did I get this whack on my head, and I won't ask you any more questions." "There was a mast or something flew around and knocked you off a boat." "Thanks." A mast had knocked him off a boat. He grinned, tried to remember. Well, that was that. But how did the hospital get in it? At noon, his nurse had been relieved for an hour by a no less important factotum that Mrs. Ashford herself, superintendent of the hospital. She sat by the window with a trifle of needlework in her hands, apparently intent upon it, but quite aware of her patient's mood and expectant of an outburst. Bobby studied her face and decided in its favor. It was a conclusion to which patients at Brightwood customarily arrived with even more promptness, but he was in no state of mind to lose his heart impetuously to anyone in this establishment where he was being treated with such contemptuous indifference. He found himself guessing her age. Everybody indulged in such speculations on first sight of Nancy Ashford. Her maternal attitude toward the staff, the nurses, the patients, was premised solely upon her white hair. The fact that she had come by it in her early 20s, at the time of her husband's fatal illness, in no way discounted the matronly authority it gave her as the general counselor at Brightwood. Notwithstanding her quite youthful face and slim, athletic figure, many people who outranked her in years called her mother, a perfect specimen of the type that instantly invites confidences. She had become a repository for a wider diversity of confessions than come to the ear of the average priest. Dr. Hudson's tragic death had been a deeper sorrow to her than anybody connected with Brightwood was ever going to know certainly, whatever might be guessed. And the business of bearing it with precisely the right outward expression of regret was the most serious problem she had ever faced. For 15 years, Mrs. Ashford had grown more and more indispensable to Dr. Hudson. Entering his experimental hospital as an operating nurse shortly after the death of her husband, a promising young surgeon and a protege of the brain specialist, she had quickly and quietly transferred many an administrative responsibility from her chief's shoulders to her own, almost without his realizing how deftly she had eased him of an increasing volume of wearisome details. The time came when her decisions represented the opinions of Dr. Hudson and went unquestioned. Nobody was jealous of her influence over him or of her calm authority over the institution. Improvident young interns sought her counsel in their troublesome business affairs. Nurses told her their love stories. Patients laid their hearts bare to her, confided everything from minor domestic perplexities to major crimes, wrote to her after they had gone home, not infrequently proposed marriage to her, deluged her with Christmas gifts. "Isn't she sweet?" the women patients would say. She was not. The word was silly, applied to her. She was understanding, tactful, and above all, strong, with the face of a young woman, the mind of a man, and the white hair of a matron. There were some other things about Mrs. Ashford which, had young Merrick known, might have changed his attitude toward her that morning as she sat jabbing her needle into the bit of tapestry and waiting for him to blow up. Dr. Hudson had taken her for granted. He had grown accustomed to confiding every difficulty to her, and only rarely was he disposed to debate any of her opinions. There was no phase of his professional life to which she was a stranger. Even some of the strictly private enterprises to which he gave himself with stealthy concern, thinking them efficiently concealed, she had discovered, either by chance or shrewd guess, and from that knowledge she had long since deduced at least a vague and troublesome idea of the motive back of them. He would have been amazed, perhaps somewhat annoyed, had he known that Nancy Ashford almost knew the one important secret of his life. How deeply she cared for him, and the nature of that affection the surgeon suspected, but resolutely refused to recognize. Anything like a mutual admission of their actual dependence upon and attraction for each other would, he felt, lead to unhappy complications. He could not marry her. Joyce would have disapproved. "A nurse? Why, Daddy? You wouldn't. You mustn't." On the morning he had told Nancy he was to be married the next Tuesday to Joyce's college friend, she had said quickly, "A very sensible thing to do. She will make you happy. I am so glad for you."
I had hoped you might think that,"
he replied, obviously relieved. Luckily for both, they were not facing each other. He was tugging on his rubber gloves in the little laboratory adjacent to his operating room, and she was buttoning his long white coat down the back. He pretended not to notice how long it was taking her.
"All right back there,"
he sang out, with attempted casualness, glancing over his shoulder. "Quite all right now," she had answered, in a tone that matched his for lightness, but it was not quite all right. Nothing would ever be quite all right again. Bobby had felt his heart warming toward the lady of indeterminate age who busied herself with the needle, evidently unaware of the tumult of his mind. He decided to disturb her peace. He would ask a few questions which he had been at some pains to compose. They sounded a bit bookish, as if memorized. It was clear enough, he said, that he had been in some kind of mess. He was forever getting into messes. That appeared to be his occupation. It was customary with him, he recited, with what sounded more like silly bravado than he had intended, to be in a bad scrape and not know the full particulars until the next morning. What was this one about? Had anyone else been hurt? He could not recall. If there were damages, he would gladly pay. If he had turned out to be a surly speech as it progressed, mostly because Mrs. Ashford did not look up from her work or seem properly attentive to the petulant complaint, mistaking her effort at self-control for but another exhibition of the indifference under which he had fretted, Bobby grew irascible. In the very middle of a spluttery sentence, however, he broke off suddenly and regarded her with perplexity. As she raised her eyes to meet his, he saw that they were brimming with tears. Her lips trembled. "What have I done?" he demanded huskily. "It's something very terrible. I can see that in your face. You've simply got to tell me. I can't stand this anxiety any longer." Mrs. Ashford put down her work on the table, came to the bedside, and, taking one of Bobby's hands in both of her own, said, "My friend, something has occurred here that makes us all very, very unhappy. It happened about the time that you came here. We are not recovered from it, but it was not your fault, and the damages cannot be settled. You need give yourself no further concern about it." Not a bit satisfied, but assured by Mrs. Ashford's tone that their discussion was at least temporarily a closed incident, Bobby made no further effort to press his inquiries. He murmured his regrets that there had been any trouble and sank into his pillows, disquieted, but whatever was the matter, it was no concern of his. That was good. That was ever so much better than he had feared. It had been a very welcome diversion an hour later when Dr. Watson had suggested the solarium. In the rumbling elevator, Bobby had made a feeble effort to be jocular. It was impossible that the grief which had seemed to distress the matronly Mrs. Ashford would be equally experienced by so young and pretty a girl as the slender blonde who stood at his elbow, silently awaiting their arrival at the top floor. "I'll bet you a box of candy against a pleasant smile," he said grimly, "that we do less talking in our hospital than any place on earth." Instantly, he realized it was the wrong thing to have said to her. She did not challenge his statement. It was not that she was offended. It was rather as if she had not heard him. She was in trouble. She was in the same kind of trouble that affected everybody else in this hospital. It plunged again into the gloom from which he had partly extricated himself through the not very reassuring statements of Mrs. Ashford. Squelched to a shamed silence by the girl's rebuff, he gazed steadily ahead, conscious of his flushed cheeks as they wheeled him into the alcove, adjusted his pillows, half-lowered the blind, moved the screen closer to isolate him from the others, and, without a word or a smile, hurried away. He must have been there an hour or more before he learned what he thought he had wanted to know. In the course of that hour, failing of scrapping together enough remembered facts to be of any service in the solution of his problem, he had gone wool-gathering in all directions. Perhaps it was his sense of utter desolation and loneliness that had set him going over the path of his singularly bitter childhood. Bobby Merrick had grown up about as independent of the normal restraints imposed upon children as could have been possible in civilized society. When he was a little lad, his father, Cliff Merrick, had been too much occupied with business, what time he was not yacht racing, deer hunting, or on other journeys not quite so clearly explained, to pay any attention to the sensitive child beyond an occasional pat on the head as he passed him on the stairs in a tow of a governess, or a brief and clumsy tussle in imitation of paternal playfulness. The big man was always half drunk when he had made these rough overtures of comradeship. The boy dreaded seeing his father approach of a late afternoon with a flushed face suggesting a good romp together. On such occasions, if she was present, Bobby's neurotic mother usually intervened. "You're much too rough with him, Cliff," she would expostulate. "He's only a little boy. You hurt him. Stop it, I tell you."
"Nonsense," his father would reply, glancing toward the governess for approval. "You don't know anything about boys, does she, Bobby?"
In all truth, she didn't, but the lad would be distressed over the episode, hardly knowing what answer was expected of him. Once, how vividly he remembered this, his mother, upon being sarcastically scorned in his presence for the way she was bringing up the soft little mollycoddle with his hands full of dolls and dishes, true enough, had shocked him by screaming in a shrill falsetto, "Leave him alone, damn you! I won't have you bullying him any more when you're drunk. You touch him again and I'll call the police." The police? For his father. Bobby remembered that it had made him ill, nauseated. The governess had had to carry him upstairs where he was awfully sick. He even remembered what it was he had eaten. Currant pudding. He had never cared much for currants thereafter. Cliff Merrick so steadily ragged the child after that about his girlish toys and trinkets that Bobby himself revolted against the soft program the women had made for him and gratefully approved when his father suggested boxing lessons. Strangely enough, he found himself happy with the new sport. Eager to test the value of the instruction he was receiving, he occasionally slipped away from the big house about time for school to be out in the afternoon, attired in an immaculate black velvet suit with white lace cuffs, and waited at the corner for somebody to yell "Sissy." When he returned home, he would be very dirty and greatly in need of repair, but grinning from ear to ear. When he was 12, Bobby's father had died suddenly of pneumonia, brought on by exposure while duck hunting in nasty weather. Young as he was, the boy realized that his mother's bereavement was accepted by her with a calm fortitude out of all proportion to her weakness for indulging in self-pity. One of her remarks, upon their return from the cemetery that bleak afternoon, was chiseled indelibly upon her son's mind. None of the epitaphs he had regarded with childish curiosity, as they drove along the slow, narrow, winding roads, was carved deeper. Sometimes, when he thought of it, he winced. Sometimes he grinned. "Well," she said, handing Colleen her furs, "that's that." "Yes, ma'am," dutifully replied Colleen, accustomed to occasional outbursts of caste forgetful confidences vouchsafed by her mistress. "It certainly is." And then, apparently dissatisfied with the rejoinder, which had taken an almost too casual view of the matter for one who entertained so wholesome a respect for death, Colleen added sepulchrally, "It must have been very hard, ma'am, to leave him out there." Upon which followed the memorable elegy spoken by his mother. "Well, I'll know now where he is." Sometimes, when, as a collegian, Bobby was at that exact state of intoxication where the tragic in a man's experience becomes distorted into broad, screaming farce, and even sacred memories make wry faces and put out their tongues in scorn of everything decent, he would recall his mother's elegiac comment, laughing uproariously, and pounded his knees. "What a corking epithet!" he had shouted once, and instantly cursed himself for a drunken fool. Bobby could not precisely remember when he had become conscious that his father and mother despised each other. It must have been while he was still a mere baby. By the time he was 8, they had stopped quarreling, their mutual contempt too ponderous for so frail a vehicle as speech. Unquestionably, she had suffered much, but it was no use trying to champion her cause. She was entitled to her son's pity, and had it. He would have been glad enough to have respected her, too, had that been possible. Petulant, selfish, suspicious, Maxine Merrick was no end difficult. Her only proficiency was her skill as a pianist, and aware that it was the sole endowment she was in position to transmit, she had begun to teach the child piano technique almost before he knew the letters on his building blocks. A restless soul she was, temperamentally cursed, with floating anxiety. Pretty, after a fashion, a transparent blonde, always attracting attention at the opera, where she took one's breath away with her beauty at 30 yards. Given to fits of melancholy, for which there was plenty of excuse, God knew. Dissatisfied with her own personality, which she constantly endeavored to improve, either by tinkering with her face and figure, or by taking her disheveled mind to quick psychiatrists and will doctors for adjustments. She was on the sucker lists for all the advertising mountebanks in town, talked seriously about palmistry, had paid a considerable sum for a horoscope which related her affairs somehow with the movements of Arcturus, frequently had her fortune told. She vibrated between institutions for the care of the body and the cure of the soul. Having spent a busy season of assiduous devotion to the business of being plucked, pickled, dyed, frescoed, and massaged, sitting long and painful hours in the studios of beauty experts, Maxine would suddenly experience an unaccountable surge of disgust and make off hurriedly to some sanitarium de luxe where, in seclusion almost conventional, she lived on unsalted insipidities and listed on evenings in the lounge to mellifluous harangues on personality expression, nerves in order, the will to live, life at its utmost, followed by less sidereal comments by the chief of staff concerning the importance of internal purity, not of the conscience, which was out of his field, as the piracy of his bills attested, but of the colon, to which he referred with a bland candor somewhat disconcerting to new arrivals, still serving their novitiate in the by no means unexacting vocation of hypochondria. During these spells of improving her health and personality, Maxine would lose many pounds and add as many new words to her pathological vocabulary. It suited her mood during such retreats to become as disdainful of her appearance as a Tibetan lama. One day, for no apparent reason other than caprice, there would be a flurry of trunks and boxes, tickets and taxis, and a swift return home, to the utter consternation of yogis who had been fattening on her patronage, and the indignant amazement of pallid charlatans whose income would be alarmingly depleted by the sudden demobilization of her crusade for the perpetual light. It would be generally rumored among the patients that Mrs. Merrick was a brilliant social leader. Simply required, my dear, to stop and rest for a few weeks now and then, if you know what I mean. Which was nonsense, for Cliff Merrick never took her anywhere, and she could have numbered her friends on her fingers. On these excursions in quest of youth, beauty, sweetness, and light, his mother never took Bobby along. He remained at home in the custody of grafting servants and an endless procession of young governesses, none of whom ever stayed longer than a few weeks. The prettier ones were the quickest to go, sometime on an hour's notice. He had put on quite a scene when Miss Newman had left without so much as saying goodbye to him, and had been slapped by his father for the racket he was making. Shortly after, Maxine had been assured that henceforth she would know exactly where Cliff was. The big house on Piedmont Square was sold, and Bobby was taken to Europe, where his mother rapidly improved in health and spirits. He was placed in a school for rich waifs at Versailles, where he fraternized with youngsters who had become an embarrassing liability to divorced parents. On brief vacations, he joined Maxine, as he obediently called her, in Paris, scowling his distaste when, in the presence of her new friends, she chattered baby talk to him, to which he made sour replies in a voice that frequently skidded off the treble clef. She had filled her spacious apartment with wigged and bangled old harridans, who swapped dull prattle about their aristocratic relatives for caviar and champagne, and was inordinately vain of her menage, which Bobby impudently insisted would be better called her menagerie. There were lonely summers at Brighton and Doyville, lonely Christmases at Cannes, private school, sycophant tutors, trains and hotels, brief, dry, hard friendships with over-sophisticated, unwanted boys like himself, envious of their mothers' Pekingeses and not infrequently dizzy with pilferings from the decanter on the sideboard. At 17, he had been sent back alone to enter a high-toned prep school in Connecticut where, for previous lack of a balanced intellectual ration and experience of steady discipline, he survived only until Thanksgiving. Headmaster Bowers saw him off on the train and returned to lead the chapel exercises. Ineffable calm sat on his brow, and his voice was vibrant with unfeigned gratitude as he announced, "We will stand and sing the doxology." Through the influence of old Nicholas, Bobby was then accepted provisionally into another preparatory school. A military academy was not quite so close to Saltwater. "It's just a ritzy reform school," he wrote on his first day to his perplexed grandparent, who replied in substance that, if that were so, it was quite the place for him. To his instructors there, he gave more bother than any other 6, but contrived to stay on. Through these days, he renewed his abandoned taste for boxing, under a preceptor who cuffed him about shamefully until he discovered that the boy was game, and thereafter took an interest in him. It was Mr. Bowman's boast, when Bobby finished with him, that I'll bet he was a bit frail in algebra. He could lick his weight in wildcats. It was at the State University, however, that Bobby had struck his stride. Neither a loafer nor a dunce, he easily ran circles around the average student in such classes as stirred his curiosity. Zoology? He ate it up. Physiology? Psychology? Chemistry? He was constantly amazing his friends by his ardent boning, especially in chemistry, in the face of his utter indifference to scholastic credit in the courses he disliked. His David and Jonathan friendship with Tom Masterson had been good for him. Better for him than for Tom, a likable youngster with an insatiable ambition to be a short story writer. They had found each other as rushees at a luncheon for freshmen in the Delta Omega house and decided on the spot to room together. Young Masterson, however eager to emancipate himself from the restraints of a rather severely disciplined household, was something of an idealist and opened up a new world to Bobby, who, listening at first because he liked Tom and later because he liked what Tom said, learned from his youthful tutor a love for the classics which, in the original, he had despised. But Masterson, not having been brought up on cocktails, was not much advantaged by the tardy instruction he received in exchange for his Greek and Roman mythology. Once he started, no matter what the hour, place, or circumstance, Tom could be depended upon to continue drinking until he was unconscious. Bobby, approximately sober, would get him home somehow and put him to bed with all the solicitude of a mother. Apparently it never occurred to him that he was jeopardizing his chum's future. "Poor old Tommy," he would say, unlacing his shoes. "I'm afraid you'll just never learn to drink like a gentleman." Nor was the Merrick influence much of a blessing upon the Delta Omega house into which he and Tom moved as sophomores. Had he been less lovable, he might have been less dangerous. His charming irresistibility was fatal to the good resolutions of many a chap who honestly wanted to stay sober and do his work. Even the seniors, by custom disdainful of juvenile society, once they were in debt to him for lavish hospitality which was at first reluctantly accepted, found themselves careening over the road in Bobby's big touring car late Friday afternoons, en route to his grandfather's home on Lake Saginaw. And the indulgent old man, believing they would all have a better time if they had had the house to themselves, and eager to be out of the racket, would be driven into the city to find sanctuary at the Columbia Club. The neighborhood used to protest, but old Nicholas always reminded them, when they complained of drunken demons, for whose conduct he was presumably responsible, driving recklessly with open mufflers and raucous sirens at all hours of the night, that boys would be boys. When they smashed something, he paid for it. Not infrequently, Bobby's weekend guests went back to Ann Arbor on Monday morning without a nickel, wearing their very socks by permission of their host, who owned them after an all-day poker game on Sunday. How often they promised themselves, never again, but it was hard to stand out against Bobby's insidious smile. Moreover, the food and service at old Nicholas's country palace was a tempting diversion from the near starvation of fraternity fare and the discomforts of a crowded house where nothing ever received anxious thought and respect but the impending payments on the mortgage. For some time, Bobby had been conscious of a dull rumble of conversation just beyond the screen. It began to annoy him. Some stupid ass was airing his home-brewed philosophy. All this talk here about Providence, bah, I say. Take this very case, for instance. Here's a noted man who has made himself so useful that people came to him for thousands of miles for help that nobody could give them but him. Look at me, for instance. Bobby scowled and muttered, Yeah, look at you. It's bad enough to have to listen to you. Look at me. I came here from Iowa, and lucky enough, I got here when I did. Last operation he ever performed, they tell me. And they might have saved his life, too, if that pulmotor thing, or whatever it was, hadn't been in use on that drunken young what's-his-name with the rich granddaddy. What right had he to be alive, anyhow? Now I ask you. It may have been Bobby's sudden pallor that attracted the attention of the nurse who sat at the little desk by the door. She quickly crossed the room and asked if there was anything he wanted. Bobby swallowed with a dry throat, attempted a grateful smile, and replied weakly, Perhaps I should go back to bed. Feel better in bed. Not very strong yet. Tell them, will you? His exit from the solarium was effected with such promptness that the patients observed it. Who was this youngster? Questions were asked and answered. The man who had discoursed of the unseemly ways of Providence was deeply contrite. Wished he'd known, he said. Bobby's nurse stepped out into the corridor after putting him to bed, and an intern passing by remarked, So he knows all about it? Well, he had to find out sometime, didn't he? Yeah, but he's a pretty good scout, and it was a rotten way to dish it up to him. You should worry, snapped Miss Bates. For hours, Bobby Merrick lay with his eyes closed, motionless but not asleep. At first he was hotly indignant. What right had these saps from Iowa, or wherever, to pass judgment on what kind of people had a right to live? How could anybody be so small-minded as to hold it against him that his life had been saved, even if it could be shown that Dr. Hudson might have been rescued if the oxygen machine had been available? It wasn't his fault. He hadn't borrowed the damn thing. He hadn't asked to have his life saved at that price, or at all. And then his resentment over this monstrous injustice gave way to steady thinking. Perhaps, after all, he was under a certain obligation to this dead man. Very good. He would show his appreciation of what it had cost to save his life. He fell to wondering whether Dr. Hudson had left his young wife and Joyce properly provided for. Joyce was extravagant. He knew what it must require to keep her going. He had had her in tow occasionally himself. See if Mrs. Ashford is free to come here for a moment, commanded Bobby. The nurse nodded stiffly, left the room, and in a few minutes Mrs. Ashford stood by his bedside. Assuming what he believed to be a mature, conventional business tone, the tone of large capital about to indulge itself in a brief seizure of magnanimity, he inquired without preamble, What sort of an estate did Dr. Hudson leave? I do not know, she replied. After a pause, added crisply, Why? The dry crackle of that why irritated him. She had given him reason to believe that she was sympathetic. Surely she might know he was not asking this question out of sheer curiosity. You seem to infer that it's none of my business, he retorted. Nancy Ashford colored slightly. Well, she snapped, is it? Bobby's face felt hot. He was at a serious disadvantage, and she was not helping him, not making the slightest attempt to understand him. You might at least credit me with an honest wish to do something about all this if I can, he expostulated angrily. I am sorry if I offended you, with forced composure. You were thinking of giving some money to the family? If they need it, yeah. Whose money? Bobby raised up on one elbow and scowled. Whose money? Why, my own, of course. Some you earned, maybe? For a moment, he was speechless with exasperation over the studied insolence of her query. Sinking back upon the pillow, he motioned her to leave him. Instead, she took her stand at the foot of his bed and, hands on hips, militantly began an address distinguished for its lack of polite ambiguity. You invited this, she said thickly. You called me in here to get some information about the Hudsons, and I'm going to tell you. And then you can pay them off with your grandfather's money. Do you know what killed Dr. Hudson? Worry. They said it was overwork that weakened his heart. I know better. The only thing that counted in his life besides his profession was Joyce. He saw her going to the dogs. Part of that was your fault. You've had a reputation for ruining all of your friends. Bobby Merrick lay stunned under the attack, his eyes wide with amazement at the woman's audacity. The poor trap tried to pull himself together. Her voice wavered a little, but she went on with resolution. Built that little house at the lake, went swimming when he wasn't able, knew he wasn't able, had provided a lung motor for emergencies, and then, at the moment when he was to have it, you're using it. You, of all people. And now you casually suggesting settling the bill with money. Something in his look, it was the look of a hurt animal, checked Nancy's passionate diatribe. Please forgive me, she muttered agitatedly. But, as I say, you invited it. You wanted to know. I have told you. Bobby swallowed awkwardly and rubbed his brow with the rough sleeve of his cotton smock. Well, he muttered hoarsely, you've told me. If you said everything you have to say, I won't keep you. She started toward the door, paused, turned about, walked slowly to the window, and stood looking out, her left elbow cupped in her right hand, the slim fingers of the other tapping her shoulder, agitatedly at first, then meditatively. Bobby watched the slowing tempo of her fingers, cleared his throat nervously, and decided to meet her halfway. That was really all I had to offer, wasn't it? Just money? She returned slowly to the bedside, drew up a chair, sat down, and rested her plump arms upon the white counterpane close to his pillow. You have something very valuable besides money, but you'll never use it. Her tone was judicial, prophetic. It's in you, all right, but it will never come out. Nobody will ever know that you had it. The money will always be blocking the way. You were much disturbed today because you overheard an impolite insinuation that your life wasn't worth saving at the price of Dr. Hudson's. Naturally, you resented that. Your indignation does you credit. However, crude as that man was, what he said was true, wasn't it? You admitted it was true when you decided to put up a cash difference. But you can't justify yourself that way. It might make things more comfortable for the Hudson family, but it wouldn't help you live with yourself again. She had taken his hand in hers maternally. Disengaging his eyes, she stared upward absorbedly and murmured, as if quite alone, He'd never do it, of course. Couldn't. Wouldn't. Too much money. It would be too hard. Take too long. But God, what a chance. Bobby stirred uneasily. I'm afraid I don't get you. If If you're talking about me? Oh, yes, you do. She nodded her head, slowly, emphatically. You know what I mean. And you wish you were up to it, but, pulling herself together resolutely, you're not. So we won't talk about it anymore. Is there something else I can get for you before I go? Bobby raised a detaining hand, and their fingers interlaced. I think I know now what you're hinting. But it's quite impossible, as you say. It's worse than impossible. It's ridiculous. Dr. Hudson was famous. Nobody can ever replace him. Oh, I say, Mrs. Ashford, that's quite too bad. I didn't mean to say the wrong thing, you know. For Nancy's eyes had suddenly tightened, as if wincing under sharp pain, and her white head bent lower and lower in a dejection strangely out of keeping with her aggressive personality. He ventured to touch her hair in a clumsy, boyish caress, murmuring again that he was sorry. That's all right, boy, she said thickly, regarding him with weary eyes suddenly grown old. You needn't worry about me. I'll carry on. My little problem is quite simple compared to yours. She straightened up, patted his hand, and smiled. Bobby raised on one elbow. You're a good sport, Mrs. Ashford. Thanks. You like people to be good sports, don't you? So do I. I'd rather be a good sport than worth millions. I expect you're a pretty good sport, too, aren't you, Bobby? He relaxed on his pillow and studied the ceiling. You're what you were talking about. It would be a sort of sporting proposition, wouldn't it? Quite. Years and years. For life. There would be no discharge in that war. She extended her hand as one man to another. I'm going now. Sure you're not angry with me anymore? He shook his head, with tightly closed eyes, and gripped her hand. The emotional tension of the past half hour was taking advantage of his physical weakness. Hot tears seeped through his lashes and trickled down his temples. Nancy withdrew her hand, stood for a moment silently regarding him, her knuckles pressed hard against her lips, then turned away and quietly closed the door behind her. Chapter 3. You say he's different, pursued Joyce interestedly. How you mean different? Sober, perhaps? Masterson chuckled. Don't be a fool. You know very well what I meant. He returned his empty glass to the silver tray of the table, settled himself comfortably into the cushions of the garden swing, and so frankly considered the slender shapeliness of the girl in the wicker chair that she shifted her position uneasily. Yes, he replied, reverting tardily to her question. He's all a sober, and then some. He's owlish, morose, prowls the night like Hamlet, has an idea that people resent his having been saved from drowning. How absurd. Did he tell you that? As much as. She thumbed the pages of the novel that lay in her lap and frowned. Well, what is he proposing to do about it? Sulk? Young Masterson indicated by a slow shake of the head, eyes half closed, and the problem was too vast for him, and meditatively tapped the end of a fresh cigarette on the arm of the swing. You'll discover for yourself that Bobby is greatly altered since his accident. I can't quite make him out. Yesterday, when I saw him at Windermere, I expected to find him in better spirits. He is almost well now. Has been walking about on the grounds for days, but he seems thoroughly preoccupied. I suggested it might improve his disposition if we threw together a little cocktail, and he said, You know where the markings are, help yourself. I shook up enough for both of us, but he wouldn't join me. And when I ragged him about it, he replied from about 10 miles off that he'd another plan in his mind. Something that doesn't include gin, evidently, I suggested, and he nodded cryptically. Something like that, he replied. You know about how little he discloses through that poker face of his when he decides to be incommunicado? So you dared him to tell you, I suppose. Nah, I just kidded him a little, but he didn't take it very nicely. Just sat and posed for the thinker. What's the big idea, I said. Gone over to Andy Volstead? What did he say? Demanded Joyce, as the pause lengthened. He said, hell no, and then mumbled, down in his throat, that he'd gone over to Nancy Ashford. And who's Nancy Ashford? She inquired sharply, flushing with annoyance over her disclosure. You ought to know, smugly enjoying her vexation. She's the superintendent of Brightwood Hospital. Oh, you mean Mrs. Ashford? I hadn't thought of her as Nancy. They must have come quite well acquainted. Why, she's an old lady. Well, so much the better, wouldn't you say? She met his banter with a grimace. You spend too much time thinking up story plots, Tommy. It's affecting your mind. Maybe so, agreed Masterson, dryly. He stretched his long arms over the back of the swing and regarded her with an inquisitive smile. Your own story grows more exciting every minute. What else do you want to know about Bobby? Joyce offered him the concession of a crooked smile. Did he say whether he was coming in soon? Nary a word on that. However, he may not feel himself quite up to it yet. Rather awkward situation, you'll admit. She nodded, and there was a moment's silence. You have Bobby and me all wrong, Tom. We were together pretty steadily in December, before Helen came. Masterson broke in with an unpleasant chuckle. I'm surprised that you remember anything about December, he teased. My own recollection of it's very pale. Yes, I'll admit it. It was rather dreadful, especially the evening we celebrated your birthday. That must have been a mighty rough night on the sea. Incidentally, I have not seen Bobby since. When he finished at the university in February, he sailed for France to visit his mother without a line to me that he was going. I had 2 short letters from him later. Then he turns up at home. Next day, this dreadful thing happens to us. She hesitated before going on. So, now you know exactly how thick we are. Does it sound romantic-like? Of course, you're bound to keep it in mind, observed Masterson soberly, that Bobby feels quite terribly about the thing that occurred out there at the lake. Never having met Helen, he's a bit shy about meeting her now. He may fear she was slightly prejudiced against him under the circumstances. I'm afraid she is, agreed Joyce reluctantly. Entire naturally that she would be. How is Helen, by the way? Oh, she's steady, the darling. Want to see her? I'll tell you here. She rose, handing Masterson her book. Helen has been entertaining a queer little lady for the past hour or more, but I think she's free now. The caller was one of Father's patients, I presume. So many people have been here lately, all sorts. People we had never heard of who came with a tearful gratitude to tell us that Father had been to them. Really, it has kept us quite stirred up. I wish they wouldn't. And letters! Today there was a long one from a man in Maine hinting that Father had saved his life somehow years ago. He didn't state the particulars, seemed rather secretive, as if there were some big mystery behind it, as if there was something he wanted to tell but couldn't. Very queer. I'll go and call Helen. She turned toward the big white house with the green shutters, and Masterson's eyes appraisingly followed her graceful movements as she crossed the lawn. Some girl. He set the swing gently in motion and hailed deeply from his cigarette. A thoroughbred. So, she was Bobby's then. What the devil did Bobby mean, trying to keep this a secret from him? Well, if she considered herself Bobby's property, and obviously she did, Bobby's pal must be loyal. However, a man could look at her, couldn't he? And wish she belonged to him? A compliment, in a way, perhaps. Debatable question, probably. But seriously, why shouldn't an artist in creative writing have as much license to admire beauty for its own lovely sake as a painter, no matter whose girl she thought she was? What a type. Not many blondes like that left in this dyed and painted world. Original colors, these. Pale gold and milk white, with the slinky-footed gait of some wild woods thing. Some girl. But what made her think Bobby was interested in her? Or was he? If so, he had kept his sentiments carefully concealed. Joyce's reappearance through the shrubbery, accompanied by her stepmother, interrupted Masterson's daydreaming. The two offered a striking contrast. Mrs. Hudson was Latin in every feature and curve. In the glossy blackness of her shingled hair, the arch of her eyebrows, the utter lack of self-consciousness in her posture and carriage. Joyce was perfect Saxon, slightly the taller. Leading the way, she seemed the older. He strolled to meet them. Helen waved her hand upon sight of him. She had adopted the role of being his senior, much to his amusement. They had often made a little game of it. He cast for the part of a spoiled 9-year-old, which he carried off with amazing skill. She, the exasperated but polite mother, endeavoring to keep her whelp in hand without making too much of a scene. They had done it quite spontaneously at the Burns one evening. Laura Byrne, upon her own testimony, had about passed out. Senator Byrne had said the skit was worth a fortune in vaudeville big time. They had thought it not half bad themselves. The conventional uniform of the bereft had only accentuated her youth. It called attention to her girlish vitality, deepened by her dimples, whitened her throat. As a severe frame on a bright etching will heighten its colors, emphasize its values. She extended a small hand and smiled. Her recent experience had left traces. She was pale and a bit remote, her appearance suggesting convalescence from a serious illness. The smile fluttered momentarily and was gone. But it was essentially the same smile that one waited for, plotted for, tried to recapture in memory, analyzed without success. Once Masterson had attempted to persuade one of his women in a story to smile like that, but she couldn't learn it. He had written of Gloria. It was more than a smile. It was a little sonata in 3 movements. It arrived first in her eyes, which gradually grew wider and bluer. Almost imperceptibly, but very disturbingly, the patrician brows lifted, ever so little, as if they asked permission. That was the adagio movement. Then suddenly, the sonata played upon her lips, as when an organist seeks with one hand a lower bank of keys for the melody. They parted to disclose the smallest, straightest, whitest of teeth. That was the scherzo movement. Instantly, however, as if the lips had become alarmed at their own audacity, they closed, demurely. But the smile lingered in her eyes, in the outer corners of her eyes, long after her pretty mouth had done with it. And that was the largo movement. Largo dolcemente. And the beholder, what of him? Ah, but his pulse ran on into throbbing, pounding strato. Masterson knew the description was silly. He had added, rather helplessly, a vastly disquieting smile, a smile to be smiled with discretion, preferably among strong-minded elderly men, relatives, if at all convenient to have relatives at hand. Helen Hudson smiled. Today, it was a sonatina. The movements were adagio, andante, lento. But it was no less stirring for its chastened mood. "It seems a long time since we last saw you, Tom," she said, in her husky contralto, motioning him to a place beside her in the swing. Joyce had remained standing. "Tommy," said she,
I had promised Ned Brownlow I would go for a ride with him. He's out front now waiting for me. Mind if I go?
Depart in peace. Masterson held up 2 fingers, pontifically. I'm in excellent hands. Joyce's slim fingers trailed caressingly across her stepmother's shoulders as she moved away.
I'll not be long, dear, she said.
Have you been getting out at all? Inquired Masterson with comradely solicitude. Helen shook her head.
Too busy. Callers come here at all hours. People one can't very well refuse to see. Patients of Dr. Hudson's and others he appears to have befriended in one way or another. I presume you recall the quite unusual number of floral remembrances.
I never saw so many.
Well, Tom, those flowers came at the direction of people from many places. From persons whose relation to us was very difficult to establish. Fully a score were unidentifiable by anyone at Brightwood. And these callers I'm receiving daily are mostly unknown to us. They come to inquire if there is anything they can do for Joyce and me. Yesterday a queer old Italian turned up and tried to present me with $1,000. That's just a sample. Their stories are quite different, what there is of them, for they're all strangely reticent. But one fact is common to all. Sometime, somewhere, Dr. Hudson had helped them meet a crisis, usually involving money alone, though not always money, sometimes just advice, and the aid of his influence.
He surely had a big heart, said Masterson.
Yes, certainly, but there's more to it than that. Lots of men have big hearts and are generous with their money. This is a different matter. His dealings with these people were something other. They all act as if they belonged with him to some eccentric secret society. They come here eager to do something, anything for me, because they want to express their gratitude. But when you pin them down and invite them to tell you by what process they got into our family's debt, they'd stammer and dodge. It's very strange. Since 2 o'clock, I've been listening to a story that perplexes me more than any of the others, probably because I prodded a little deeper into the mystery. An old lady I didn't know existed came to tell me what a wonderful man Dr. Hudson was, and could she be of any aid to me? I'd like to talk it over with someone. Would it bore you?
Tell me, please.
Well, it all began, said Mrs. Wicks, when an operation on her husband. Dr. Hudson had warned them it was hopeless. The family was left destitute. She says there was no bill sent from the hospital, that Dr. Hudson found a good position for the older boy and sent the girl, who had some talent for drawing, to an art school. She pointed that lovely marine over the mantel in our living room and said, "That's hers." She gave it to him. It was exhibited by the Architectural League in New York. Dr. Hudson had stood between them and disaster, she said, until they were able to look out for themselves, and when, a couple years later, she went to his office with a small payment on the debt they owed him, he refused to accept it, said, at first, that he had had enough joy out of it, and didn't want to be repaid any further. She quite insisted, and he said, "Did you ever tell anybody about our little transaction?" "No," she replied. "You told me not to, and I didn't." "Then," he declared stoutly, "I can't take it back." Of course, she was dissatisfied to leave it that way. She has all the instincts of a lady, but when she pressed him to take the money, he explained, "Had I considered this a loan, I could accept its repayment. I did not regard it so when I invested it in your family. You've all been much more successful and prosperous than I thought you were going to be, so since I believed I was giving it to you outright, I can't take it back now, because in the meantime, I have used it all up myself."
"Pardon me," said Masterson. "I don't believe I quite understand. What was the last thing he said to her?" Helen nodded mysteriously and repeated the inexplicable phrase.
"You may well inquire," she went on. "I said, Mrs. Wicks, what that meant, and she grew restless. I can't say I rightly know," she stammered.
"But you have a suspicion."
At that, she hurriedly changed the subject by taking a bulky purse from her handbag. She pressed me to take the money. It had been invested, she said, and now she wished to restore it to us. I said to her, if Dr. Hudson refused to accept it, so shall I. You had best reinvest it. Put it back where it was, if it yielded a good rate. Oh, I can't do that, she replied. They're quite done with it, you know. Well, after that I gave up. She was over my head.
Perhaps she's a bit cracked,
hazarded Masterson. Helen was thoughtful.
Yes, she would be cracked, and we could let it go after that and smile over it if she was the only one of her species.
You mean you've entertained some more like her?
She nodded. Yesterday, a quite well-known merchant called on me. You would recognize his name. His affair with Dr. Hudson dated 10 years back. He wanted to pay me a pretty large sum of money, which said was interest on a loan. I thought it odd that he was coming forward with it after so long a time, and he confessed that Dr. Hudson had refused it. So did I, of course. My curiosity had the better of me, and I pressed him to tell me about it. He said that about 10 years ago he was on the rim of failure. He had started in business for himself, had overreached, and, as if he was not having enough anxiety, his wife passed through a lengthy and expensive illness. He had built a beautiful home. It was more than half paid for. He decided to let it go at a cruel sacrifice to get cash to put into his tottering business. He listed the house with a real estate concern. It was worth $35,000. He was offering it for $20,000. There was a temporary depression of real estate values. Well, next day, he said, Dr. Hudson came to see him. I understand you're selling your home for $20,000. Why are you doing that? It's worth twice that much. The young merchant explained that he must have money immediately or his business would fail. I'll lend you $20,000, said Dr. Hudson. I haven't it, but I can get it. Pay me the principal of this loan when you are prospering again. I shall not expect any interest, because I have use for it myself, and you are not to tell anyone while I live that we had transacted this business.
What an odd deal,
commented Masterson.
Wait until you hear the rest of it, said Helen quietly. Within 3 years, my caller said he had returned the money and was insistent upon paying interest on the loan. Dr. Hudson refused to take it. And what do you think he said when he declined to accept the money?
Give up.
He said, I can't take it, you see, for I've used it all up myself. Now that's 5 distinct times I've heard that phrase in this past week. What do you make of it?
Queer, said Masterson. Couldn't have had something to do with his income tax, could it? You know, like so much allowed for gifts, charities, and the like.
Tommy, don't be foolish.
Well, have you a theory?
Not the faintest glimmer of one.
Then, animatedly,
did you ever hear the story of Dr. Hudson's early life?
Nah. Does it offer a clue to these queer performances of his?
Not at all. At least it offers no clue to me. Perhaps to a psychologist, which I am not, but I think I'd like to tell you. It's no secret. You see, Wayne's parents were very poor. They lived on a farm upstate somewhere. He had to look out for himself early. As a boy, he wanted to be a surgeon. He came to Detroit at 15 to enter high school and work in the home of a Dr. Cummings.
And married to his daughter. I knew that much.
You're going too fast. In the Cummings home, Wayne Hudson was errand boy, hostler, accountant, and on occasion, nurse, cook, private secretary, and rescue squad.
Rescue? How's that?
Helen hesitated.
This Dr. Cummings was a very capable man with a large practice, but unfortunately, he drank too much. Periodically. At intervals of anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 months, he would disappear for days. It was Wayne's duty to track him down, clean him up, bring him home, and meantime invent excuses for his absence and serve as a shock absorber between the doctor and all his interests, the hospitals, the patients, the family.
Not a very pleasant occupation for a high school boy.
No, agreed Helen, but calculated to mature him early, and it was not by any means a thankless task. Dr. Cummings was, of course, deeply appreciative, and in his repentant moments assured him of his lasting gratitude. He sent Wayne to college later and guaranteed his medical training with the life insurance policy, which, strangely enough, became accessible exactly when he needed most of it. For Dr. Cummings died when Wayne was a senior in college.
Perhaps that helps to explain Dr. Hudson's marriage while he was still a medic, commented Masterson. Doubtless the girl was fond of him. He felt under heavy obligations to the family. That and the propinquity. So he married her.
Not quite that, corrected Helen. He was very fond of her. He had given up everything to be in Arizona with her until she died. For more than 4 years, she was his chief concern. Naturally, he couldn't give proper attention to his work. He told me he had days of depression while in the medical school, fearing he had mistaken his vocation after all. His studies were hard, and he had difficulty keeping up with them.
One would think, hardly, that Dr. Hudson had ever found his studies difficult.
He continued to find them so for fully a year after his wife's death. Then something happened. No, I do not know what it was. He did not tell me, and I did not insist. But something happened. One day he became conscious of a new attitude toward his books, his profession. He worked whole nights in the hospital laboratory without fatigue. Then, soon after, through an odd circumstance, he was obliged to do a difficult operation at 3 o'clock one morning on an emergency case, a head injury. It attracted much attention, and from then on he specialized in brain surgery. You know how well he succeeded.
Masterson closed one eye and considered her thoughtfully.
I can see, measuring his words, that it's somehow in the back of your head that this rather remarkable change in him, this quite sudden step up from depression, sense of failure, halfway notion to quit medicine and sell bonds or something, into prompt recognition and success. I think you suspect it's all tied up around this funny business of his charities. Am I right?
She nodded.
Mostly, however, because there are 2 mysteries about him. I suppose I have tried to relate them unconsciously, perhaps. They have no association at all. Maybe he could have told me all about it had he lived, but we've talked enough about mysteries, Tommy. Let's go and look at the asters.
Masterson followed her through the garden, admiring her childish enthusiasm over the autumn flowers. It was as if she caressed them. He knew she expected him to go now, and toyed with his keys.
Don't stay in too closely, he admonished. These people will wear you out.
I'm taking a few days off. Going up into the country tomorrow to see Martha, our caretaker's sister. She's not very well, dreadfully broken up, you know, and I haven't seen her since it all happened.
Might I drive you up? I should like to.
Thanks, but I shall want my car while I am there.
We might tow it.
Oh, do you really want to go up there so badly as all that? I'll tell you what you may do. Drive Joyce up to Flint Ridge Sunday afternoon. Probably I'll be lonesome by that time.
They strolled together to the gate.
How fine it is that you and Joyce still have each other.
Yes, isn't it?
He stepped into his car, waved a hand, and disappeared around the corner. Slowly, Helen retraced her steps to the garden, sauntered along the narrow path, stooped to cup her pink palms around a garish dahlia. How fine it was that she and Joyce still had each other. Or had they?